I need to start this show from take it from the top. Yeah. Where's the? Which one's play?
Over on the right.
How do I start it?
There you go.
The other right. Which right?
The other way. The other one.
There you are. There you have it, folks. All right, so good evening, all. So tonight I'm going to be covering the blanket subject. Well, I won't be covering it in a blanket way, but of crowd psychology. So just as a matter of interest, how many of you feel like you've had some experience with it, have some knowledge of the word? All right, well, that's more than I expected because, see, crowd psychology is something of a less known psychology because it's kind of been swept under the carpet of social psychology for quite some time now. And that will become apparent to you, and I will explain it. But before I do, I want to give you a bit of a background and see if you can kind of understand why that might be. So, crowd psychology became a prominent science sometime late 1700s, and if you have your history books memorized, you would know that that is around the time of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution was kind of an example of what the world was going through at that time. It was a time where cities started becoming more central hubs for larger groups of people, and people were moving out of countrysides and condensing in more cities. So the occurrence of a crowd was less rare, and it was more of a day-to-day life type of thing. So crowd psychology, being what it was developed to kind of help ruling bodies or just anyone understand the actions, the gathering, and the sort of motives of a crowd. And as demonstrated by the French Revolution, not everyone understood it too well. And, all right, I mean, go ahead, laugh about a bloody, horrible event. But anyway, I'm sorry. I should really stick to my topic. But so the French Revolution is a good example of how much power crowds had at that era of time. So a crowd ultimately had the power to overthrow a ruling body. Now, a ruling body ruled over a crowd, but it wasn't without the crowd having the ultimate veto power of overthrowing a government. Now, if you look at today's sort of condition, there are not many nations that have crowds capable of overthrowing their government. If all of us were to go and storm the White House, go try and overthrow the US government, even if we were somehow managed to destroy the White House, that would hardly cripple the United States government. So we're at a time where crowds have a lot less physical power over the government. We still have a voice, but we don't have the physical manpower to overthrow a government. So that is the reason that I've found that crowd psychology has become a lot more scarce, because if it's not threatening the government doesn't need to put money into researching it, and the government does have a lot of sway over what gets researched and what doesn't. So when I was kind of paging back and looking at some old papers, I found a question that really kind of fascinated me. It was a highly contested question back in the era of crowds and psychology and all that. But the question of, within a crowd that has destructive intents and destructive purpose, who in that crowd is accountable for its actions? Is everyone accountable? Is nobody accountable? Are a few people more accountable than others? I'm looking at you. So these are kind of the three sides that I heard argued. Now, I didn't actually hear them because there's no record of these debates. There's no resolution for any of these debates. All I know is that they happen. I don't have any sort of back and forth recollection of it. But it's a good basis to start on. So what I kind of set out to do is find which of those sides I found the most believable and what I actually believed how I believed individuals were accountable for the actions of a crowd. So I would like to kind of start out, before I get into some of the more psychological stuff, is talking about what defines a crowd. Now, I am going to be using a definition given to us by Elias Canetti. He is the author of Crowds and Power. It's a great book. You should all read it if you are into that sort of thing. He's kind of a rambler like me, but anyway, if you enjoy this, you might enjoy the book. So he kind of laid out 4 basic principles that make up most crowds. Now, the level at which these principles exist, or these elements exist, defines what type of crowd it is. So an audience versus a mob. So the first of these principles being, the crowd always wants to grow. Any sort of crowd, any sort of active crowd is always looking to expand, is always looking to bring more people in, and not to say consume, but grow over a larger course, like a larger, be a lot bigger, you know? Oh, that's 2. Can I go back? Yes, I can. All right. Within the crowd, there is equality. So this is probably the most important part of the crowd, is to what level they feel equal. Now, in some crowds, like particularly mobs, there is an overall feeling of equality, meaning that to the point where it's not even thought of. There's no thoughts of, this person is a different race, this person is a different class. There is no reason that they are any different than you. There is an overall feeling of equality throughout the crowd, and that is perhaps the most important of these principles. Next would be, the crowd loves density. Now, when I say density, I mean a physical closeness between all members of the crowd. The closer the crowd is, the more intense the crowd is, and the more physically close people are, the more mentally close they are, if that makes sense. 4th being, the crowd needs a direction. Now, a crowd without a goal or a purpose, or an unattained goal, will not stay together very long. The crowd always needs to be doing something, it always needs to be seeking something, and as soon as its purpose is complete, it will often disband. Or if it cannot complete its purpose, it will disband. But it always needs to be moving in a direction to stay together. So from this definition, there's not really much that we can say about accountability. I mean, when you think about the actions a crowd may commit, which may include burning things, which may include, we're talking about an angry crowd, a destructive crowd, which many are. Not you guys, you're pretty calm. But, not too destructive yet. We'll have to see by the time I reach the end if they're not flying off. But so there's no reason at this point for you to believe that anyone in a crowd would be anything but guilty. Because, I mean, the actions of a crowd, they should belong to everyone. Yeah, I mean, they're burning a building. So what part? Oh, I was part of the crowd. I didn't burn the building. It's not my accountability. It's not my responsibility. I didn't do it. I was a part of the crowd. The crowd did it. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense at this point. But there are a couple concepts that we need to kind of take into account when we're thinking about general accountability. Now, the first is kind of the bread and butter of the crowd psychology area. It was first noted in a book by Gustave Le Bon. Let's get him up. There he is. So Gustave Le Bon wrote a book, and I forget what day it was posted, forgive me. Not very good at this. But he theorized the level, a theory called de-individualization, or de-individuality, depending on how you lose it, like I am now. But anyway, so he theorized 3 stages of involvement with a crowd. When you become a part of a crowd, the first stage is submergence. This is becoming a part of a crowd, and this is where de-individualization starts to take effect. De-individualization, in short words, I hope I know them, but I'm not very good at speaking in short words, but he theorized it as the moment that you sort of stripped away all the complex emotions, all the things that make you like your personality, and conform you to a crowd, because keep in mind a crowd is equal. So when it takes away everything that makes you, not in a bad way, but when it kind of strips away all this personality, it makes you unindividual and part of the crowd. That's the first stage. And contagion is where this effect kind of spreads to everyone in the crowd. And it kind of makes sense as an awakening, where the crowd is sort of realizing its power. Once everyone is equalized, the crowd is complete. And then the next is suggestion. Now, during the suggestion phase, any sort of idea, any sort of thought between the crowd, shared between the crowd, instantly becomes action. If all the crowd dislike a certain building, they're going to all go and burn it down, because that's the suggestion. The idea comes, it becomes action. So this is Le Bon's theory of de-individualization. Now, another key concept that we have to keep in mind is anonymity. I never pronounced that word right, but I hope I did it right tonight. Anonymity?
Spot on.
My judges? All right. Good. All right. So anonymity is an effect whereby a person becomes anonymous. I'm sure you're all familiar with that word, and I can now pronounce it. But so anonymity is becoming anonymous has an effect on the mind whereby you no longer feel fully accountable for your actions. So I think something that really explains this well is if you've ever been to the dentist to get a filling, you get a numbing agent. You get Novocaine in your lip. And if you were to bite your lip really hard, you would never feel it. You wouldn't feel that you're tearing your lip apart, but you'd still be doing it. But would you be doing it if you didn't have Novocaine in your lip? Would you be tearing your lip apart if you didn't? So that's kind of like almost a justification through the ways of anonymity in that people perform actions in a crowd that they wouldn't otherwise do because of anonymity. They can't feel their actions because they don't feel responsible, because they don't feel personally accountable. They will not feel the full weight of their actions because they're anonymous within the crowd. Now, lastly, I want to talk about how crowds take their direction, which is by rule of least common denominator. So the least common denominator is a way of saying what everyone has in common, what everyone shares within a crowd. So all the complex emotions that you may have, any reason you may have, are boiled down to emotions like sad, angry, happy. So it doesn't matter why you're angry. It doesn't matter where your anger is coming from. It doesn't matter where it's going. If you're angry, and the mob will become, and if enough people in that mob are angry for whatever reason, it will be an angry mob. Basic way of saying it. So I think now we're getting close to getting our thesis answer. Who is accountable? That is Philip Zimbardo, by the way, who is a psychologist, not exactly a crowd psychologist, but if you're interested in him, look him up. I don't have much to say about him, I'm sorry. I originally had him in here, but anyway. Moving on. So now a word I've been using pretty freely is accountability. And I haven't really explained what I mean when I say accountable. So when I talk about accountability, what I mean is that if you're accountable for something, you and only you are responsible for an action. That you take full responsibility for an action, an action belongs to you. So keep that in mind as we proceed. So now the first theory I have here, or the first scenario we have here, is that of the guilty individual. This is the theory that one individual in a crowd can be more accountable for his actions than another. Now, I think this one personally is kind of silly, but because it really goes against the fundamental concept of a crowd. There are scenarios in which it makes sense, but if everyone in a crowd is equal, it can't have a leader, it can't have someone who's more responsible than anyone else, because a crowd is equal. Nobody in a crowd stands out more than anyone else. Now you could say, so if a person is leading or manipulating a crowd, they're not a part of the crowd. So they're not a guilty individual within the crowd. They may be guilty, but they are not a part of the crowd, so it is not the guilty individual scenario. While it doesn't make sense within my thesis, it is something. You can manipulate a crowd. So the second being the guilty crowd. Now this concept is mostly based around convergence theory. And to explain that, it is basically the thought that crowds form in like-minded people. So anyone who may be destructive, anyone who may be violent, will join a crowd that is likely to be destructive or violent. And anyone who does not have that tendency will not join that crowd. So the crowd is entirely formed of people who have that tendency. Now, a counter-argument to that is pretty much what I explained earlier about de-individualization, in that your means and your thoughts are not your own in a crowd. They belong to the crowd. So even if everyone in the crowd did have those tendencies, it wouldn't really matter because their tendencies are no longer their own when they are part of a crowd. So the last one I want to talk about is the guiltless crowd. Now this is what I personally believe, so I might be a bit biased. I might have done a little bit more research on this after my research led me to this. So the guiltless crowd is a conclusion I kind of came to after reading more of Elias Kennedy's book, Crowds and Power. So, because a crowd, when you really define it, you could say, now just hearing the words, you could say a guilty crowd and a guiltless crowd are the same thing. Because if everyone in a crowd is guilty, no individual is personally guilty. And I've heard that argument made. I personally don't think it makes a ton of sense, because the way I view a crowd is more than the part, its sum is more than that of its parts. A crowd is not it is a grouping of individuals, but it is more than that. When you become a crowd, you are more than a grouping of individuals. You become almost a separate entity. And Elias Kennedy put it very wisely in his book. I'm going to read a quote for you all now. Let's see if I can get Kennedy back. Yeah, no. There you are. All right, so crowds are not who they are, but what they do. Not identities, but actions. Thank you.